As the winds whistle through the dark pine forests of Eastern Europe, we travel back, more than 1,000 years. Before palaces, before emperors, before even the idea of Russia existed, there were the forests, the rivers, and the tribes. This land was vast and wild, stretched between the Baltic and the Black Sea. In these lands lived the East Slavs, a collection of tribal peoples who farmed the soil, hunted the woods, and lived in small wooden villages surrounded by nature's silence. They were not yet united, not by law, not by kings, and not by faith. But the rivers, they told a different story. The great waterways of the Dnieper, Volga, and Don became natural highways. Trade flowed through them like veins, connecting the cold forests of the north with the warm empires of the south. Along these river routes came traders, warriors, and whispers of a different world. By the 9th century, a new power had emerged, a federation of Slavic tribes ruled not by Slavs, but by Norsemen from Scandinavia. These were the Varangians, adventurers and merchants, known to history as the Russ. They came down the rivers, and one of their leaders, Rurik, is said to have founded the first dynasty of what would become Russia. His capital? A humble trading post called Novgorod. But it would be Rurik's descendant, Oleg of Novgorod, who would push southward and seize the rich city of Kiev. From there, a new kingdom was born, Kievan Rus, a powerful and wealthy state that connected the Slavic world with Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire. In these early centuries, Kievan Rus became a cultural bridge. They adopted literacy, coins, architecture, and diplomacy from the Byzantines. But perhaps the most enduring gift came in the year 988, when Prince Vladimir the Great embraced Christianity. Not just for himself, but for his entire people. Vladimir ordered the mass baptism of his people in the Dnieper River, marking one of the most important spiritual moments in Russian history. The Russian soul, shaped by vastness and silence, now found its voice in Orthodox Christianity. With golden domes rising and icons glowing by candlelight, the land was no longer just a wilderness, it had become holy. Orthodoxy brought with it a sacred tradition, the Cyrillic alphabet, church music, religious art, and the belief in Moscow as the Third Rome, an idea that would grow powerful in the centuries to come. But for now, Kievan Rus stood as a beacon of civilization in the north. Its princes traded with emperors, its clergy wrote in Greek, and its warriors defended their lands from nomads and rivals alike. Still, this peace would not last forever. Kievan Rus was not one empire, but a fragile web of city-states. As generations passed, the unity frayed, rival princes rose, and the great federation slowly unraveled. But the seeds had been planted. The name Rus had taken root. The Orthodox faith had entered the people's blood. And in the dark forests and quiet rivers of the north, a powerful identity had begun to awaken, one that would one day become the Russian Empire. The golden light of Kievan Rus was dimming. As the 12th century faded into the 13th, the once great confederation of Slavic cities had splintered. Rival princes quarreled, brothers fought over thrones, and unity dissolved like mist in the morning sun. But far beyond the steppes to the east, a storm was building. From the heart of Asia, a new force had emerged, swift as wind, ruthless as fire. The Mongols, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, had conquered everything in their path. After his death, the conquest did not stop. It grew. And in 1237, the Mongol tide rolled westward into the lands of the Rus. They came not as traders or pilgrims, but as an army unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Mounted archers, precise and brutal, moving like shadows over snow. One by one, the cities of Kievan Rus fell. Ryazan was the first to burn, followed by Suzdal, Vladimir, and eventually Kiev itself in 1240, once the proud jewel of the Slavic world, now left in ash and silence. The Mongols ruled with iron will. Those who resisted were destroyed. Those who submitted were spared, but at a cost. The Rus princes became vassals, forced to bow before the Mongol Khans and deliver tribute year after year. This period came to be known as the Mongol yoke, a century of humiliation, fear, and quiet endurance. And yet, in the long shadow of conquest, something began to grow. To the north, where the forests were thick and the rivers still safe, a small town began to rise in importance. It was not grand like Kiev or famous like Novgorod, but it was well positioned, far enough from the main Mongol routes and close to key rivers and trade lines. Its name was Moscow. Founded in 1147, Moscow had been little more than a wooden outpost. But during the Mongol era, its princes were clever, cautious, and loyal to the Golden Horde. In return they were favored. They were granted titles. They collected taxes on the Khan's behalf. And with every coin that passed through their hands, their power grew. Perhaps the most significant of these princes was Ivan I, known as Ivan Kalita, Ivan Moneybag. He became Grand Prince of Vladimir in the 14th century, a title that gave him dominance over rival cities. But he did more than gather wealth. He built alliances with the church, helped move the Orthodox metropolitan seat to Moscow, and began turning the town into a spiritual center. While other cities rebelled and suffered, Moscow remained obedient and quietly expanded its influence. Brick by brick, church by church, it began to emerge as something greater. But the Mongol grip would not last forever. In 1380, a bold and fateful moment arrived. The Prince of Moscow, Dmitry Donskoy, raised an army of Russians and faced the Mongol forces at the Battle of Kulikovo. Though it was not a final victory, it was a symbolic one. For the first time the Rus had stood together, and won. The legend of Moscow as protector of the Russian people had begun. The Mongols would return and their power would linger into the 15th century, but the tide was turning. The fire that had once destroyed Kiev had unknowingly forged a new center of power. Through patience, faith, and strategy, Moscow had survived, and it would rise. The forests that once hid the village now sheltered the heart of a future empire. Under the Mongol shadow, Moscow had learned to wait, and when the moment came, it would lead. You said. The fires of conquest had cooled, and Moscow stood taller now, its cathedrals gleaming with golden domes, its princes no longer whispering in fear of the Mongols. By the early 16th century, the tides had shifted completely. The Golden Horde had fractured. The tribute had stopped. And a new title echoed through the corridors of Russian power. Tsar, the Caesar, the Emperor. But before Russia could truly become an empire, it would need a ruler both visionary and terrifying. That ruler would be born in 1530, under a cold Moscow sky. His name was Ivan, and his story would be etched in blood and brilliance. Ivan's childhood was cloaked in shadows. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died when Ivan was just 3 years old. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, ruled as regent, until she too died mysteriously, perhaps poisoned. Ivan was left alone, raised in the Kremlin among scheming nobles, whispered threats, and silent corridors. He was a child surrounded by cruelty. The boyars, Russia's powerful aristocrats, ruled in chaos, ignoring the young prince. They beat him, mocked him, and treated the future ruler like a prisoner. But Ivan remembered. And when the crown finally rested on his head, he would never forget. At the age of just 16, Ivan was crowned in a ceremony unlike any before it. In 1547 he took the title not of Grand Prince, but Tsar of all Rus. For the first time Russia had an emperor. And Ivan was determined to make his realm mighty. In his early years, Ivan surprised everyone. He was intelligent, deeply religious, and passionate about reform. He created a council of nobles, modernized the army, strengthened the church, and introduced a legal code that brought a degree of order to the vast, unruly land. He even married a gentle noblewoman, Anastasia Romanovna, who brought him peace and stability. But peace is fragile in the mind of a man shaped by fear. When Anastasia died in 1560, something inside Ivan shattered. He became suspicious, paranoid, and cruel. Convinced that the boyars had poisoned her, he unleashed a reign of terror that would forever define his legacy. He created a secret police, the Oprichnina, a ruthless force dressed in black robes, riding black horses, with severed dog heads tied to their saddles, symbolizing their loyalty and ferocity. Towns were purged. Nobles were executed. Lands were confiscated. And in Novgorod, an entire city was massacred, accused of disloyalty. Ivan ruled not just with a crown, but with dread. And yet, even as fear gripped his people, Ivan expanded the Russian frontier. He launched military campaigns eastward, conquering the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, breaking the last remnants of Mongol power. He opened trade routes with England. He dreamed of reaching the Baltic Sea. He saw Russia not as a distant, cold land, but as a future empire. But dreams turned to ashes. his war for access to the Baltic, the Livonian War, dragged on for decades, draining resources and lives. Famine spread. Discontent grew. And Ivan's mental state deteriorated. In a moment of rage in 1581 he struck and killed his own son, his heir. The image of the old Tsar cradling his son's lifeless body would become one of the most haunting portraits in Russian memory. Ivan died 3 years later in 1584. He left behind a shaken country, stronger, larger, and yet fractured. The dynasty was weakened. The people were traumatized. But something irreversible had been done. Russia was no longer a land of princes. It had become a centralized state, ruled by one man, one faith, one vision. The title of Tsar was here to stay. Ivan had carved the future with fire. His legacy was brutal but undeniable. He was the first to truly claim Russia as an empire, and his shadow would stretch far beyond his death. The empire was broken. The throne was empty. And Russia had fallen into darkness. It was the year 1605, and the legacy of Ivan the Terrible had left the country in chaos. His brutal reign, followed by the short and tragic rule of his feeble son, had weakened the state. When the Rurik dynasty came to an end, no rightful heir remained. What followed was one of the most painful periods in Russian history, a time of famine, foreign invasion, rebellion, and fear. It came to be known as the Time of Troubles. During these years, Russia saw more than a dozen false claimants to the throne, known as the false Dimitris, men pretending to be the dead son of Ivan the Terrible. Poland and Sweden, sensing weakness, invaded from the west. The capital was burned. The people starved. Noble families turned against each other. The Orthodox Church stood bewildered in the face of lawlessness. But amid the smoke and silence, voices of resistance began to stir. In 1612, a national movement rose, not led by tsars or generals but by commoners. A merchant from Nizhny Novgorod, Kuzma Minin, and a prince, Dmitry Pozharsky, united the people. Together they formed a volunteer army, marched to Moscow, and drove out the foreign occupiers. The nation was not dead, it had only been sleeping. Now the people needed a new ruler. Not a tyrant. Not a warlord. But someone they could trust. Someone young, untouched by corruption, yet tied to noble blood and faith. That man was Michael Romanov. At just 16 years old, Michael was living quietly in a monastery with his mother. He had no desire for power. But in 1613, a gathering of nobles, clergy, and citizens, known as the Zemsky Sobor, unanimously chose him to be the new Tsar. After initial hesitation, Michael accepted. His coronation was held in the Dormition Cathedral, where the church bells rang louder than they had in decades. Thus began the Romanov dynasty, a line of rulers that would stretch more than 300 years, from the chaos of the time of troubles to the grandeur of palaces and finally, to revolution. Michael Romanov's rule was marked by rebuilding. He focused on stabilizing the economy, re-establishing central authority, and restoring the dignity of the church. He was cautious, devout, and careful not to provoke the still powerful boyars. But perhaps his greatest success was simple. He brought peace. In the following decades, the Romanovs would gradually strengthen their control. A balance was formed between church, crown, and army. Russia, still battered, began to heal. Cities were repaired, farms revived, and Moscow was once again filled with life. But the Romanovs were not merely caretakers, they were builders. Under their guidance, Russia would not only be restored, it would grow. The memory of the time of troubles never left the Russian consciousness. It became a lesson, a warning, that disorder must never return. From this lesson came the Romanov style of rule, firm, unified, and deeply entwined with the Orthodox faith. The boy crowned in a time of fear would become the patriarch of a new imperial line. And though his own reign was quiet, his descendants would roar across history. The Romanovs had risen. A new chapter had begun. And the empire was ready to dream again. The land groaned under the weight of its suffering. After the death of Ivan the Terrible and the accidental killing of his heir, Russia slipped into a nightmare. No true ruler remained. The throne stood empty, and the nation dissolved into chaos. This era, known as the Time of Troubles, was one of famine, betrayal, and foreign invasion. Peasants starved and fields turned to ash. Boyars, the great noble families, fought for power in a brutal game of survival. Tsars rose and fell in rapid succession, some real, others impostors like the infamous false Dmitry who briefly ruled before being thrown from power and killed. Even Poland and Sweden seized the moment, marching their armies into Russian lands. The people had seen enough suffering. They longed not for glory but for stability, for someone who could restore order, rebuild faith, and silence the drums of war. And so, in 1613, a miracle of unity occurred. Representatives from all corners of Russia, nobles, clergy, merchants, and commoners, gathered in a national assembly known as the Zemsky Sobor. After weeks of discussion, one name rose above the rest: Michael Romanov. He was just 16 years old, quiet and modest, living in a monastery with his mother. But he was descended from noble blood and, more importantly, untainted by the violence and corruption of recent years. At first, Michael resisted. He feared the weight of the crown. But the country was desperate. A delegation of messengers reached him in the remote town of Kostroma. Tearfully, his mother told him, "You must accept, for it is God's will." And so, young Michael Romanov was crowned Tsar of all Russia in the Dormition Cathedral in the Kremlin. Church bells rang across Moscow, candles flickered in the cold, and for the first time in decades, hope returned. Michael was not a conqueror. He was not a reformer or a warrior. But he was exactly what Russia needed, a symbol of calm after the storm. His early reign was cautious. He restored ties with the church, re-established trade, and sought peace with foreign enemies. Most importantly, he began to mend the broken bond between ruler and people. Under his guidance, Russia slowly healed. The boyars, once unruly, were brought back under control. The peasantry was stabilized. The economy, devastated by war and famine, began to breathe again. Grain returned to the markets. Soldiers returned to their homes. It was not glory, but it was peace. And though Michael's reign was quiet, its impact was profound. He laid the foundations for a dynasty that would rule Russia for over 300 years. His family, the Romanovs, would preside over Russia's transformation from medieval kingdom to continental empire. The scars of the time of troubles never vanished, but they taught a lasting lesson. Unity was survival, and power must be strong enough to prevent collapse. In Michael's coronation, the Russian people did not just crown a czar, they crowned a future. A dynasty was born not out of conquest but out of necessity, and with it, the long road toward empire truly began. The Russian Empire had been reborn under the Romanovs, but it was still a world apart from the great powers of Europe. Its cities were wooden, its armies outdated, and its customs deeply rooted in tradition. Yet from within this old world came a young man with a towering vision, a man who would wrench Russia into the modern age with fire, force, and fierce determination. His name was Peter Alexeyevich Romanov, known to history as Peter the Great. Born in 1672, Peter was unlike any Russian ruler before him. He was restless, curious, and obsessed with the West. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, towering over his court, with piercing eyes and a mind that never stopped learning. As a child, he spent more time in workshops and shipyards than in palaces. While other nobles learned to ride, Peter learned to build ships with his own hands. He ascended the throne as a young man, but true power came to him in 1689, when he took full control of the state. From that moment, Peter launched a transformation so radical, it shook the very foundations of Russian identity. He began by breaking tradition. He dressed not in robes but in European coats. He shaved the beards of his nobles, once seen as sacred, and demanded that boyars wear Western clothes. He traveled across Europe in disguise, studying shipbuilding in Dutch docks, anatomy in German hospitals, and military science in Austrian academies. This journey became known as the Grand Embassy, and it changed him forever. Peter returned to Russia not just inspired, but determined. He created a modern navy from nothing. He restructured the army, introducing discipline, uniforms, and modern weapons. He built factories, opened schools, and established secular universities. He simplified the alphabet, introduced newspapers, and promoted the sciences. No corner of Russian life was left untouched. But progress came at a cost. Peter ruled with an iron hand. Those who resisted his reforms, whether nobles, clergy, or peasants, were crushed. The Streltsy rebellion, an uprising of elite soldiers, was brutally suppressed. Thousands were executed, and their bodies were left hanging as warnings. Even Peter's own son, Alexei, was accused of treason and died under mysterious circumstances in prison. The most symbolic act of Peter's reign was the creation of a new capital, a city carved out of swampland on the shores of the Baltic Sea. He called it St. Petersburg. It was his window to the West, a city of stone and marble, canals and cathedrals, built by tens of thousands of laborers who toiled and often died in its construction. St. Petersburg became a symbol of Peter's ambition, a cold, dazzling mirror of European elegance planted in the Russian north. Here, the Tsar lived not as a distant autocrat, but as an emperor among equals, engaged in naval drills, diplomatic dinners and scientific experiments. Peter's greatest triumph came in 1721, after a long and brutal war against Sweden. Victory in the Great Northern War secured Russia's access to the Baltic Sea and declared its arrival as a European power. For this achievement, Peter assumed a new title, Emperor of all Russia. He had done what no ruler before him dared. He had reshaped Russia's destiny. And yet, his reign was not without its shadows. The cost of modernization was immense, measured in lives, suffering, and lost traditions. Many wondered, had Peter brought Russia forward, or had he torn it away from its soul? Peter the Great died in 1725, exhausted and ill, after rescuing drowning soldiers during a storm. He left no clear heir, and his reforms sparked generations of struggle between the old and the new. But his legacy endured. He had turned Russia from a kingdom of timber into an empire of stone, from isolated to connected, from mysterious to modern. And the world would never see Russia the same way again. After the towering legacy of Peter the Great, Russia stood transformed, modernized in form, yet still searching for its soul. The decades that followed saw instability, palace intrigue, and power struggles. But then, unexpectedly, the empire found itself ruled not by a Romanov by blood, but by a foreign-born woman whose ambition would match even Peter's. Her name was Sophia von Haltzerbst, a minor German princess born far from the Russian snows. But history would remember her as Catherine the Great. Brought to Russia as a bride for the heir to the throne, the young German princess converted to Orthodoxy and took the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna. Her marriage to Grand Duke Peter was cold and loveless. Her husband, Peter III, was erratic, immature, and deeply unpopular. But Catherine was different, intelligent, composed, and quietly building alliances in court. In 1762, when her husband ascended the throne and quickly alienated the army and nobility, Catherine made her move. With the help of loyal guards, she staged a coup. Peter III was deposed, and shortly after, died under mysterious circumstances. Catherine emerged not as a regent, but as Empress of all Russia. She was a foreigner by birth, but more Russian in heart than many natives. Her reign would become one of the most celebrated in Russian history. Catherine embraced the ideals of the European Enlightenment. She read Voltaire and corresponded with Diderot. She surrounded herself with philosophers, artists, and scientists. Under her rule, Russia became not just a military power, but a cultural one. She modernized the legal code, reformed the education system, and promoted the arts. She founded the Smolny Institute, Russia's first school for girls. Libraries, theaters, and academies flourished. Portraits of Catherine showed her not only as a monarch, but as a scholar, draped in classical robes, holding a scepter and a scroll. But Catherine's brilliance extended beyond philosophy. She was a skilled strategist and an ambitious ruler. Under her command, Russia expanded massively. She defeated the Ottoman Empire, annexed the Crimea, and pushed Russian borders deep into Eastern Europe. Through a series of partitions of Poland, Catherine claimed vast new territories, effectively erasing Poland from the map. By the end of her reign, Russia had become the largest continuous empire on earth. Yet behind the grandeur, contradictions lingered. Catherine supported Enlightenment ideals, but suppressed uprisings. She corresponded with liberals but tightened control over the serfs. The most famous of these rebellions, Pugachev's rebellion, shook the empire to its core. A Cossack named Yemelian Pugachev claimed to be the dead Peter III and led a massive revolt of peasants and soldiers. It was crushed, but it left scars on Catherine's conscience. Still, her grip on power never wavered. She ruled for 34 years, longer than any female ruler in Russian history. Under her, St. Petersburg glittered with European elegance. The Hermitage Museum was born. Russian thinkers, composers, and painters entered the global stage. When Catherine died in 1796, she left behind an empire larger, richer, and more cultured than ever before. Though her reign was marked by iron rule and personal complexity, her vision of Russia as a world power, intellectual, imperial, and modern, was fulfilled. She had come to Russia as a foreign bride, but died as one of its greatest sovereigns. And as the candlelight faded in the Winter Palace, the legacy of Catherine the Great remained, a reminder that power, when wielded with brilliance, can reshape an entire civilization. While the courts of St. Petersburg glittered with elegance and Enlightenment ideals, far beyond the palaces, beyond the cities and rivers, lay a vast and untouched frontier. It was a land of snow, silence, and staggering size. To the east of the Ural Mountains stretched the great wilderness of Siberia, and beyond that, the unknown. Few empires have ever ruled a space so immense. Russia's eastward expansion had begun centuries earlier, even before Peter and Catherine. It started in the 16th century, during the reign of Ivan the Terrible, when the Tsardom pushed past the Urals into lands once controlled by Tatar Khanates. But it was under the Romanovs that this expansion would accelerate into something truly imperial. The engine of this growth was not armies alone, but explorers, traders, exiles, and the lure of fur. Russian adventurers, known as Cossacks, crossed rivers and mountains in search of wealth and new territory. They followed ancient paths, built forts along riverbanks, and founded outposts in the wilderness. With each step they claimed land for the Tsar, whether or not it was already home to indigenous peoples. The push eastward was relentless. By the late 1600s Russia had reached the Pacific Ocean. The sun now rose and set within Russian lands. This expansion came not with monumental battles but through endurance. Settlers faced icy winters, wild terrain, and isolation. But they endured. And so did the empire. The vastness of Siberia became both a resource and a mystery. Rich in timber, minerals, and animal pelts, it supplied the empire with wealth, but also became a place of exile. Those who opposed the Tsars, rebels, intellectuals, or prisoners, were sent east into the cold silence of forgotten provinces. In time, Siberia would become a land of both punishment and opportunity. And still Russia pressed onward. In the 18th century Vitus Bering, a Danish explorer sailing under the Russian flag, crossed the narrow strait between Asia and North America. He proved that Alaska was reachable, and by the mid-1700s Russia had established colonies there. Russian America was born. In this frozen corner of the New World, Orthodox missionaries, fur traders, and sailors set up settlements, bringing Russian language and religion across the sea. The outpost of Sitka became the capital of Russian Alaska, a distant and fragile thread connecting two continents. At the same time, Russian forces pushed into Central Asia, clashing with Turkic Khanates and absorbing ancient Silk Road cities into the empire. From the Black Sea to the Pacific coast, from the Arctic tundra to the Kazakh steppe, the empire spread like ink on parchment, silent, steady, and unstoppable. By the 19th century the Russian Empire had become the largest continuous land empire in the world, stretching over 11 time zones, covering more territory than any other country had before. But such scale brought challenges. Distance made governance difficult. Communication was slow. Cultural tensions brewed between the Russian core and the many ethnic groups within the empire's vast borders: Tatars, Kazakhs, Yakuts, and countless others. Some were assimilated, others resisted. And yet, for the Romanovs, this expansion was proof of destiny. They believed it was divine will, that Russia had been chosen to bring faith, order, and civilization to the endless East. Orthodox crosses were planted. Roads were carved through forest and ice. And the map of the empire grew ever wider. But beneath the snow and silence, the weight of empire was building. For now, however, the Russian eagle soared higher than ever before. It had become more than a European power, it had become a continental colossus, a land empire unmatched in scale and ambition. From the palaces of St. Petersburg to the icy shores of Kamchatka, Russia stood tall. An empire of the East, and far, far beyond. While the glittering chandeliers of the Winter Palace shimmered above court balls and royal decrees, far from St. Petersburg and Moscow, life told a different story. Beneath the grandeur of empire, millions lived not as nobles or rulers, but as serfs, soldiers, and the faithful. For centuries, the serf was the beating heart of rural Russia, bound to the land, to the will of landlords, and to a fate passed down like inheritance. Serfdom in Russia was not merely poverty, it was legal bondage. A serf could be sold with the soil, traded like livestock, or punished without recourse. Though not slaves in name, their reality was not far from it. From sunup to sundown, serfs tilled frozen fields, raised livestock, and endured brutal winters with little more than rags and resilience. Their lives were framed by hardship, their years marked by toil, and their hopes carried in the songs they sang during long days of labor. Yet even in their struggles they found meaning in ritual, tradition, and faith. The Orthodox Church was more than a religion, it was the spiritual spine of Russian life. In quiet wooden chapels across the countryside, icons of saints flickered in candlelight. Bells called the faithful to prayer, and liturgies filled the cold air with chants older than memory. The Church was both comforter and enforcer, offering peace to the soul and obedience to the Tsar. Priests stood as community leaders, guiding peasants through baptism, marriage, and burial. Saints like Seraphim of Sarov and Sergius of Radonez were not distant legends but living presences in the minds of the faithful. Miracles were believed. Pilgrimages were made. And across Russia's vastness, the cross was carved into daily life. But not all commoners bowed quietly. The soldier held a different place, neither noble nor peasant, but something in between. Recruited from villages and cities alike, Russian soldiers marched in Tsarist wars from Poland to the Caucasus, from Crimea to Siberia. Life in the military was often harsh, with decades-long service and strict discipline. Many were conscripts, young men taken from their families to serve a crown they barely understood. They slept in barracks, marched in boots too large or small, and died on distant battlefields. Some returned as heroes, others never at all. And yet, out of this mixture of oppression and pride, something deeper emerged: Russian endurance. A unique kind of strength, born not of luxury but of survival. In songs, in prayers, in silence, the Russian people endured. They built churches from stone and huts from timber. They passed down stories, crafted icons, and lit fires against the dark. Beneath every ruler's decree and every noble's wealth stood a vast foundation of ordinary people. It was they who harvested the grain, manned the armies, and kept the faith. They who bore the empire on their backs. Even as reforms swept through the empire, from Peter's modernizations to Catherine's court philosophers, the lives of serfs changed little. Some dreamed of freedom. Others clung to the familiar. But by the 19th century, a new wind began to blow, whispers of change, of rebellion, of liberation. For now, though, the empire held together with tradition and loyalty, hardship and hope. In the silent countryside and crowded barracks, beneath icons and Tsarist banners, the soul of Russia lived not in palaces, but in the hearts of its people. The year was 1812. Europe was burning under the weight of one man's ambition: Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. He had conquered kingdoms, redrawn borders, and humbled ancient dynasties. But there remained one vast empire he could not yet claim: Russia. For years, tensions simmered between the two powers. Treaties had been signed, alliances made and broken. But Napoleon's thirst for domination knew no limits. When Tsar Alexander I refused to fully submit to Napoleon's trade embargo against Britain, the French emperor gathered the greatest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men, known as the Grande Army. And so, in the summer of 1812, they crossed the Neman River, marching into the heart of Russia. The invasion had begun. Napoleon expected a swift victory. But what he found instead was emptiness. As the French advanced, Russian forces retreated, avoiding major battles and leaving behind nothing of value. Entire villages were abandoned and burned. Fields were stripped bare. Supplies were destroyed. It was war not with swords alone, but with silence and fire. This was Russia's strategy: scorched earth. By denying the invaders food, shelter, and rest, they turned the very land against them. And with every passing mile, Napoleon's army thinned, starving, exhausted, and confused. Still the French pressed on. The bloodiest clash came at Borodino, just west of Moscow. On that smoky September day, over 70,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in a single brutal battle. The ground was soaked in blood, and yet, neither side could claim a clear victory. But it was enough for the Russians to retreat again, this time to protect something more symbolic than strategic: Moscow. When Napoleon entered the ancient capital, he expected surrender. Instead, he found the city abandoned and aflame. Fires raged for days, likely set by the Russians themselves. Palaces, markets, churches, all turned to ash. The emperor had captured a corpse of a city. No peace offering came. Napoleon waited in the ruins for weeks. But winter was coming, and with it Russia's greatest weapon. By October, the Grande Army began its long retreat. Snow fell early. Roads turned to ice. Horses collapsed. Men froze in their sleep. Attacked by Russian partisans, harassed by Cossack riders, and chased by hunger and frost, Napoleon's once great army disintegrated. By the time they crossed back into Poland, fewer than 100,000 men remained. The Russian victory in 1812 was not just a triumph of arms, but of will, space, and nature. No other European power had withstood Napoleon. But Russia had done it, by sacrificing its own, by retreating to survive, and by letting fire and snow do what swords could not. This moment reshaped Russian identity. It became a symbol of national strength, divine protection, and endurance. The Church hailed it as a holy victory. The people saw it as proof that Russia could withstand anything. And Tsar Alexander I returned to Europe not as a survivor, but as a liberator. He marched his armies westward, helping defeat Napoleon once and for all. By 1814, Russian troops entered Paris. The empire, once invaded, now stood at the gates of its enemy. The war with Napoleon showed the world that Russia was not just vast, it was unyielding. Not even the greatest general of the age could conquer its soul. The year was 1812. Europe was burning under the weight of one man's ambition, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. He had conquered kingdoms, redrawn borders, and humbled ancient dynasties. But there remained one vast empire he could not yet claim, Russia. For years, tensions simmered between the two powers. Treaties had been signed, alliances made and broken. But Napoleon's thirst for domination knew no limits. When Tsar Alexander I refused to fully submit to Napoleon's trade embargo against Britain, the French emperor gathered the greatest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men, known as the Grande Army. And so, in the summer of 1812, they crossed the Neman River, marching into the heart of Russia. The invasion had begun. Napoleon expected a swift victory. But what he found instead was emptiness. As the French advanced, Russian forces retreated, avoiding major battles and leaving behind nothing of value. Entire villages were abandoned and burned. Fields were stripped bare. Supplies were destroyed. It was war not with swords alone, but with silence and fire. This was Russia's strategy, scorched earth. By denying the invaders food, shelter, and rest, they turned the very land against them. And with every passing mile, Napoleon's army thinned, starving, exhausted, and confused. Still the French pressed on. The bloodiest clash came at Borodino, just west of Moscow. On that smoky September day, over 70,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in a single brutal battle. The ground was soaked in blood, and yet, neither side could claim a clear victory. But it was enough for the Russians to retreat again, this time to protect something more symbolic than strategic: Moscow. When Napoleon entered the ancient capital, he expected surrender. Instead, he found the city abandoned and aflame. Fires raged for days, likely set by the Russians themselves. Palaces, markets, churches, all turned to ash. The emperor had captured a corpse of a city. No peace offering came. Napoleon waited in the ruins for weeks. But winter was coming, and with it Russia's greatest weapon. By October, the Grande Army began its long retreat. Snow fell early. Roads turned to ice. Horses collapsed. Men froze in their sleep. Attacked by Russian partisans, harassed by Cossack riders, and chased by hunger and frost, Napoleon's once great army disintegrated. By the time they crossed back into Poland, fewer than 100,000 men remained. The Russian victory in 1812 was not just a triumph of arms, but of will, space, and nature. No other European power had withstood Napoleon. But Russia had done it, by sacrificing its own, by retreating to survive, and by letting fire and snow do what swords could not. This moment reshaped Russian identity. It became a symbol of national strength, divine protection, and endurance. The Church hailed it as a holy victory. The people saw it as proof that Russia could withstand anything. And Tsar Alexander I returned to Europe not as a survivor, but as a liberator. He marched his armies westward, helping defeat Napoleon once and for all. By 1814, Russian troops entered Paris. The empire, once invaded, now stood at the gates of its enemy. The war with Napoleon showed the world that Russia was not just vast, it was unyielding. Not even the greatest general of the age could conquer its soul. It was the year 1914. The Russian Empire, vast and proud, marched to war, once again drawn into the chaos of Europe. World War I had begun, and Tsar Nicholas II stood at the helm of a nation unprepared for the scale of bloodshed to come. At first there was patriotism. Crowds cheered. Banners waved. The Russian army surged toward the front. But hope faded quickly. The empire's armies were poorly equipped, its generals divided, and its supply lines broken. Battles like Tannenberg turned into catastrophes. Millions died and millions more suffered, soldiers without boots, peasants without bread. Back home the cracks widened. Cities ran out of fuel. Trains stopped running. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Inflation soared. Famine returned, and in the harsh Russian winter, hunger bred anger. Nicholas made a fatal decision. He left the capital to take personal command of the army, hoping to inspire victory. But instead he left the government in the hands of Empress Alexandra, and through her, Rasputin. While Nicholas fought a losing war, the people watched the empire crumble from within. Ministers were appointed and dismissed in whispers. Rumors swirled. The mystic Rasputin, once a healer, now seemed like a curse. In 1916, a group of nobles finally murdered Rasputin, hoping to save the dynasty. But it was too late. By 1917, the storm could no longer be held back. In Petrograd, women marched for bread. Workers joined in. Soldiers refused to fire. Protests turned to riots, and riots turned into revolution. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, was forced to abdicate on March 15, 1917. 300 years of Romanov rule ended in silence. A provisional government took control, trying to balance power and reform. But the people wanted more: peace, land, and bread. And in the shadows, a revolutionary leader returned from exile. His name was Vladimir Lenin. With fiery speeches and a simple promise, all power to the Soviets, Lenin rallied the workers and soldiers. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in a near-bloodless coup. Red flags were raised. The Tsar's palaces were emptied. A new era had begun. The Russian Empire was gone. Its lands fractured. Its nobility scattered. The royal family, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children, were imprisoned and later executed in secret. The world shifted. What rose from the ashes of the empire was not a kingdom or a republic, but a Soviet state. Communist, radical, and entirely new. Yet even as new banners flew, echoes of the empire lingered, in architecture, in memory, in language and myth. The world would come to know Soviet Russia, but behind it stood centuries of empire, of tsars and saints, wars and winters, revolution and silence. As the red sun rose over Moscow, the empire that had once ruled from the Baltic to the Pacific became a story told in history books, whispered in churches and buried beneath snow.